Dr. Paul Gilbert, welcome back to Shrink Wrap Radio.
David, it's a great pleasure, and thank you so much for inviting me. We had a great time last time, so I'm delighted to be back again.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad to have you back again because I have to tell you, you're back by popular demand. I was hearing from people who didn't realize that we had had that previous interview, and they're saying, you must interview Paul Gilbert. You must talk to him. And so,
That's wonderful. Thank
so
you.
yeah, so here we are again, and your fame and magnetism is drawing more and more people your way. And so today we're going to be, and I think it was back in, I think it was 3 years ago that we spoke. I think it was in 2017.
Gosh, time flies, isn't it? Gosh,
Oh boy, does it
2017.
ever. So today we're going to be talking about your book, and it's the second edition of your book that's titled Living Like Crazy, a title which seems all too appropriate right now with this whole COVID-19 thing wasn't even happening then.
That's right.
And
Yes, that's right.
and uh, what's the story behind the second edition? You kind of speak to that in the beginning of your book, and I think it's kind of interesting. It sounds like it was kind of, well, you tell us. I got the impression maybe it was kind of lying dormant and you'd moved on, and then your daughter got you stoked up about it. Is that right? Tell us that
Yeah,
story.
that's right. So in the 1980s, I'd been working a lot on motivation processes in relationship to mental health difficulties and wrote a book called Human Nature and Suffering. This was a little bit of a counteracting process to some of the cognitive approaches, arguing that the way in which our mind has evolved to compete and to be anxious and so forth can set us up for all kinds of mental health problems. So some of the reasons that we have mental health problems is partly to do with the way that the brain has evolved. And then after that, a couple of years later, I wanted to write the book on how culture can bring out the best or the worst in us. So we are potentially one of the most compassionate species. We have medicine, we've cured the world of smallpox, we do wonderful things, but also we are a species of extremes because we are also one of the most vicious, nastiest, cruel species that have ever existed on this planet. If you think about the Roman games or the Holocaust or slavery, the tortures we've invented are just nightmarish terrors, really. So how come we can be these extremes, you know? So I started to write this book, which I called Living Like Crazy,
Yeah.
really to highlight the fact that a lot of the ways in which we have created our environments have good aspects to them, but also have driven us nuts, really, partly since the agricultural revolution, since of agriculture, where our groups started to get very big and we created hierarchies. And at the top of the hierarchies, typically there arose aggressive males. If you look at nearly all of the major civilizations, from the Vikings, the Romans, the Syrians, the Egyptians, they all basically had aggressive males at the top, supported by an underclass of henchmen, soldiers, secret police, armies who kept them in position, and the rest of the population kind of struggled, you know. So the poor were always very poor. So agriculture created a completely different way in which the human brain had to operate, and it
Yeah.
has basically driven us nuts.
Yeah.
So that was then, and I sort of read that in the 90s, but then I got pulled away from that. I had other books to write on depression stuff. And as you say, what happened was my daughter in about 2018 found this book on my hard disk where she was looking for
Oh,
something else and said, "Oh, can I publish this? You know, I've just set up a publishing business. Can I publish this?" And I said, "Sure, yeah, why not?" So that's how that came about. Otherwise, it wouldn't have ever seen the light of day.
that was great because I got a nice note from her that she has listens to Shrink Wrap Radio,
Yeah,
and
she
that gave
loves
me,
it. Yeah.
yeah, that gave me a big boost, big shot of adrenaline there. I
Wow,
thought, oh, that's very exciting.
it's wonderful. Radio.
Yeah. So I have to say, given that you are, noted as the founder of compassion focused therapy, uh, I initially found this book very dark, because in fact you shine a light on the dark side of our nature that is so well documented, throughout history. And I assume that you're uh, that your interest in compassion must have had some relationship to some involvement at some point in your life with Buddhism. Would I be right about that?
Oh, very much so. Yeah, very much
And
so.
and what was the order of, in terms of your professional development? When did your interest in Buddhism begin?
Well, I was like, in the post 60s era, following the Beatles, with
Yeah.
the Maharishi and transcendental meditation and
Oh, sure.
incense. And I used to go, when I was at university, I used to like to go to the meditation groups, partly because a lot of young ladies used to go to the meditation groups. So I
Aha.
kind of,
Yeah.
I kind of got into that then. But I got very interested in the issue of meditation, and then from there, I'm more interested in the Buddhist concepts behind meditation. Didn't do a huge amount, to be honest, over the years, and then gradually in the mid 2000s, I met up with a Buddhist monk in a monastery and spent some time there, and got more deeply into the Mahayana traditions and mindfulness and other things. So I'd always had an interest, but it wasn't until about 2005, something like that, I really started to uh, develop that interest with my own practice and so on.
Yeah, interesting. And I would guess that we're of about the same generation. And so the 60s were very important for me. I was in graduate school from the mid 60s on to 1970. And yeah, so a major milestone.
Yeah,
And so many of our generation who went into academia, who were youngsters in academia, went on to find ways to incorporate those early experiences, do the research and the science to kind of justify it in the Western academic tradition. And it's been great fun to me to interview people who are more or less my contemporaries and who, in some ways, followed a similar path. And so, one of the things I thought I would ask you when we started out was, well, what do you mean by living like crazy? But there was a passage in your book, if you will allow me to read from your book, that I thought just nailed it so well and will get us off to a good start. And it also will give our audience a good sampling of your thinking and writing and the feeling for the book. Okay?
yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. We are the inheritors of cultures that utilize slaves to build their power bases, waged horrific wars, and created social contexts of inequalities that we are in some ways still trapped within. We are all born to live in cultures that formed from complex histories. Every moment emerges from the preceding moment, to quote a Buddhist insight, you say. Therefore, we have to adopt the living practices of our culture, whether or not those living practices are conducive to our well being. In fact, very little thought has been given to how to create societies that are conducive to human peacefulness and well being. Rather, more is given to the military for weapons development and defense against other tribes, and to entrepreneurs to compete with each other in any way they wish, regardless of the damage they do to the environment and to us, who have to work to us who have to work for a living. It's difficult to look back on much of recent history and find societies that were specifically focused on improving the well-being of all. The Industrial Revolution, with its grimy, miserable, dark factories and mines, created places people would not choose to spend much of their lives in, but of course, they had no choice. At its core, this book is about how we have inadvertently created cultures that are in some ways grossly abnormal. Some of this abnormality is wonderful. For example, modern medicine, sanitation, and the ability in the West generally to enjoy freedom from famines. But, but a pandemic is not too dissimilar from a famine, I must note here, from famines. But some of it forces us to live in very crazy and destructive ways. Here, I will simply say that crazy is the way in which we are willfully destructive and use our intelligence harmfully and irrationally, close quote. So I
All right.
just thought that really set up the framework for your book
Yeah.
beautifully, beautifully.
Thank you, David. That's great. Yeah.
And then what you proceed to do in the book is to take a very deep dive. It ends up being a very scholarly book, I have to say. And you take a deep dive into history, social history, into philosophy, going back in some cases, 2,000 or more years, and into the evolution of Western science and psychology, and also particularly evolution, looking at evolutionary psychiatry. You had some buddies that for years you hung out with who were evolutionary
Yes.
psychiatrists, and
That's
I
right.
guess they had a big influence on you.
Very much so.
And then I'm more familiar with evolutionary psychology, and I was wondering, is there a difference between the two, or is it pretty much synonymous?
Well, it's very overlapping. Evolutionary psychology really is about evolution of a whole range of psychological processes. For example, how we form attachments to our children, our interest in certain sexual partners, and so on. Whereas evolutionary psychiatry is more about how evolution has created a mind that's vulnerable to mental health problems. Whereas evolutionary psychology doesn't specifically look at mental health problems, but evolutionary psychiatry is all about how evolved mechanisms make us vulnerable to mental health problems.
Yeah, and somewhere in
Mhm.
in your travels, your intellectual travels, you ended up devoting a good deal of attention to depression in particular.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Why was that? How did that come about? And what did you find out?
Well, I was very lucky because when I went off to do my PhD, I went to Edinburgh and worked on what is called a medical research council unit. And we had a ward, and we had a lot of the more difficult and complex cases, depressed cases from all over Scotland. And my professor said, look, just spend time on the ward, just talking to people, just go around and talk to people. And you're not trying to do therapy, you're just trying to find out their stories and get familiar with what it's like to experience depression. So I did that for 2 years as well as doing a PhD. And of course, then a lot of the themes that were coming through from depressed people were feeling of failure, feeling worthless, feeling no point in life, wanting to escape, and so on. And so I was just very puzzled by why would our brains be capable of such misery. And so that was what partly set me off on trying to understand what are the evolved mechanisms for depression. And we now know there is about 3 or 4 of them, but in those days that wasn't so clear. So I became very interested in why the mind would throw individuals into such a terrible state of suffering where for them life just didn't seem worth living.
And I guess we have learned in more recent years that our brain is to some degree biased in a negative direction. Um, and do you agree that that's where
Yes,
things
that's
have
right. I
gone?
mean, we tend to focus on the threats more than the positives.
Yeah, and that there was survival value in that,
Yeah,
and that's why it's there, and why there are circuits in the brain and networks in the brain that seem to be heavily weighted, if you will, in that direction.
yeah,
Yeah, so I've struggled with depression. I think on and off most of my life. Never got hospitalized or anything, but it was have really felt that tug. As a matter of fact, there's some genetic history I discovered later when I discovered more about my family.
yeah, yeah. Well, I think the point, what's very difficult for humans for us to come to terms with is the fact there are mechanisms in our brain that will turn off positive emotions. And now, one example is only one example, but if you are in a situation, if you're an animal in a situation where you get heavily defeated by a more powerful other, then you have to lose confidence. You can't afford to display confidence or show an interest in going after food or resources because the dominant will hit you. So the only way you're going to survive and in that group where you're vulnerable to downrank attack is to keep your head down.
Yeah,
Don't get too confident. Don't get too confident. And those are the mechanisms that get triggered in the brain when we get into depression. So they rather overdo it in the human case, but and you get all of the same themes of being useless and of failure and no good and other people are better than me. All the themes associated with being a subordinate in a threatening environment, all of those themes are very common in depression. So that's why we suspect that the mechanisms that have been around for millions of years that allow subordinates to survive and not get too injured by going hunkering down and being submissive. Those mechanisms are the mechanisms that are getting triggered in some depressions.
Yeah, and I think you go on to speculate that that maybe that mechanism is involved in followership. There's
Yes,
leadership and followership, and that in the face of powerful governmental officials or powerful military people,
yes,
it kind of snaps us into that
yes.
very extremely different. And you wrote about it. You didn't go on and on about it, but you wrote about it in a way that triggered me to remembering when I was a kid, and older, bigger, stronger kids would I would be pinned down. They have their knees on my shoulders, and I'd be pinned, um, and that feeling is just terrible because you realize you can't do anything. You're helpless. You're totally subject to this other person, and
Yes.
uh, and so that's we could call that an archetypal experience, maybe, because you write about archetypes. Surprise, your book is so wide ranging, and so archetypes play an important role. Talk to us about archetypes.
Well, I think that's a brilliant example that you make, because what would have happened in that situation is that your fearful, subordinate, submissive defense would have been triggered. I mean, you probably don't remember trying to struggle to get up to fight, or you just wanted to escape from being injured, I would imagine. So that would have been triggered in you. Once it's been triggered, unfortunately, then we can become sensitized to it being triggered again.
Uh-huh.
So in situations where we feel vulnerable to be not physically pinned down, but that sense of being overwhelmed by more dominant, or getting into a conflict that we think we're going to lose, that can re-trigger those trauma memories and systems again. So that's pretty horrible for you, really. Um, so uh,
Archetypes.
yeah, so that's an archetypal experience in the sense that it's a capacity that's in all of us. So basically, what an archetype is, it's an inherited meaning-making system. So, for example, Jung talks about the hero archetype.
Hmm.
You know, now George Lucas, who knew Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand
Oh, one of
Faces.
my favorite books. Taught out of it for many years.
Yeah, so that's archetypal. That's a process within all of
Sure.
us. As we grow up, as we move into adolescence and so forth, we need to leave the family to go out and make our fortune, to face the challenges of the world, and so on. And
Yeah, and I thought in some ways you went beyond Jung, um, to away from those archetypes that we know from Joseph Campbell, to a recognition that there are situations in life that we are confronted with, and they've just got something to do with the fact of being human, of the way we are social creatures, and so on, that are likely to occur. We have to deal with the issues of life and death, with infirmity, and so on. And so there are archetypal elements to all of those kinds of things. Am I treating you properly here?
no, that's brilliant, David. That's absolutely correct. And they're archetypal because we all have to face them. Okay,
Yes.
all of us have to face the process of aging, the process of losing people we love, and preparing for our own departures. So these are human, universal experiences that all of us have to find some way of navigating. So
Yeah.
that is exactly as you say. That's archetypal.
Yeah. Yeah. And let's see what else. So you say you describe us as having a biosocial mind. Maybe you can expand that for us.
Well, what it means is that we have a whole range of biological systems that we obviously need to function. So these are systems which orientate the brain for threats or rewards, or to find, pleasure in sex or whatever it is, or eating chocolate cakes or whatever. So there's a whole biology that's there for us. But socially, the social context shapes that biology. So we know that the environments that we grow up can even affect genetic expression. It's called epigenetics. So if you grow up in a very trusting environment, caring environment, you're much more likely to develop a trusting and caring orientation to other people, to be able to develop your friendships easily and so forth. And you develop your epigenetic profile facilitates that for you, so your brain grows that way. But if you grow up in an abusive, hostile, frightening environment, then you don't need a brain like that. You need a very different type of brain to allow you to survive and prosper in a potentially hostile environment. And your certain genes will be turned on and off in you in order to build a brain that allows you to be much more threat sensitive, probably more impulsive, less emotionally regulated, less trusting. So this is where the social and the biology have a very close relationship, because we're needing to adapt our behaviors and our emotion regulation to the environment we're in. Okay, and then of course the psychological aspect is that we will then develop our beliefs and assumptions and ideas about the world according to how we experience the world. So if we grow up in a hostile, violent relationship, then we will have beliefs around that. I mean, as you probably read, we often say to our clients, look, we're only versions of ourselves. If I had been kidnapped as a 3-day-old baby into a violent drug gang and I'd seen a lot of violence, I had violence on me, this version of Paul Gilbert wouldn't exist at all. A totally different version, a different genetic profile, different epigenetic profile, a different form of wiring in my brain, a very different version of Paul Gilbert. So, and I wouldn't have chosen to be kidnapped. So I wouldn't have chosen that version, but that would be a very different version of me.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's the biosocial bit, I think, that's so important for us to get hold of.
Yeah, what comes so clear in this book and in your writing is how complex we are. It's like systems within systems within systems, and uh, it's not all in the brain. It's not all in how you were raised. It's not all in your um, what else is there in your one of the things that you kind of fight against is the notion that mental illness, that model that we are sick somehow in the brain, uh, is not, it doesn't tell the whole story. It's not always helpful. And yeah, I think you put a lot more weight on the impact of child rearing, early experience, socialization, and all of that.
Yes, very much so, very much so. I mean, I think when I was in Edinburgh in the 70s, in the MRC, in the medical research council, a lot of my colleagues there were all psychiatrists and physiologists. So they were doing a lot of work on the brain and receptors and drugs. And I was one of the psychologists saying, yes, but a lot of those physiological changes in the brain, they might well be caused because of social or psychological factors. So we're trying to get these individuals to realize that actually these weren't diseases in that sense. They were the triggering of different states in the brain. So you could turn on and turn off systems in the brain according to the types of stress people were exposed to. And then a guy that you would have heard of, I'm sure, Martin Seligman, did his famous work on learned helplessness and
Yeah.
showed that when you subject animals to stress over a period of time they cannot control, their levels of chemicals in their brain like dopamine and serotonin, they just gradually disappear. They go down, they go down a lot. So these are examples where you could show these changes in brain state as a result of these psychologies. So I think for us psychologists, it's very important that we don't get carried away by the fact that we can demonstrate major physiological changes in depression, which we can. Those physiological changes are associated with feeling absolutely terrible, being very anxious, feeling ill. A lot of the patients I used to see used to feel just ill. They had no energy. But that doesn't mean it's a disease. It can still be the triggering of a state because of overwhelming stress from childhood or wherever it is. And it's understanding how you can then, the point about therapy is how can you reactivate systems? How can you turn systems back on again? What therapies do we need to get the brain kick-started out of these depressed states? That's the key thing. Now, if you follow a disease model, the only thing that will do it will be drugs. Whereas
Yeah.
if you follow a psychological model, then psychological and social inputs can do it.
Yeah. So now we actually have evidence that psychotherapy is can change brains.
Yes,
And,
absolutely.
whereas before it was a very strict separation,
Very
that
much.
there were drugs and neurons, and that was that world, and that therapy was in no way related to all of that. But
Absolutely. That's
yeah,
absolutely. And that dualism was a real problem. And it's still a problem to some degree
yeah,
in some circles. Yeah.
yeah, um,
This isn't to say that some individuals are more genetically vulnerable. For example, bipolar disorders does have a genetic component to it, and that does produce swings in mood states and so forth. So it's complicated because it's not all psychology, but it's
right,
certainly not all biology either.
yeah. And then there's gender, because earlier you were talking about the uh, the influence of males on history and our aggressive tendencies.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, One of the things you write about is shame. As you write, shame is, you write that shame is one of the most powerful, painful, and potentially destructive experiences known to humans.
Yeah.
So, how does shame fit into living like crazy?
Well, um, one of the things that's extremely important is for us to have a sense of social connectedness, sense of social belonging. It's very, very important that, I mean, there are some individuals who stand outside of that, like, psychopaths or whatever, but mostly for most of us, social belonging, having a sense of acceptance that people care about you and they value you is very important. And this was certainly very important in hunter-gatherers, because if you got shamed and shunned and got kicked out the group, that was basically a death sentence, because
Mhm.
you just, you wouldn't have survived on your own in the African jungles and so on, at least not for very long. So loss of social connectedness is a major threat. It's an archetypal threat to
Yeah,
humans, right?
yeah,
So the fear of being looked down on, being seen as inadequate or a failure or bad in some way, and wanting to be pushed away, there's a great fear, because when somebody is shamed, they have this great sense of disconnection, great sense of not being wanted, being pushed away by others, being the outcast, the reject, all of that stuff. So the experience of shame is very, very, very powerful. And there are two types of shame. There's three types actually. Well, there's external shame, which is that I can feel shamed in your eyes, so you're looking down on me, and I can feel bad because you're looking down on me. But there's also the shame I do myself by
mhm,
being very self-critical and telling myself I'm a bad person and I'm no good and I'm a failure, and then that shames me. Now, the only thing shame will do is to make you feel bad. Shame will never excite you, encourage you, inspire you. Shame will always drag you down. Now, people say, oh, yeah, but don't you think shame can be helpful? Can't it stimulate you to try to change? Well, it can do that, but it's ideal that we change because we see the benefits of changing, not because we're frightened. So the key thing about change is that shame may alert you to the fact that you made errors or whatever, and to change your behavior. That might be one of its functions. But you've got to be able to then move out of a shame state, because if you can't move out of a shame state, if you just constantly get stuck in a shame state, then that can be very damaging.
yeah. What about? I was thinking about dogs and other animals that they look like maybe they're experiencing something like that, right? When the dog is rebuked, hangs its head and won't look you in the eye, gets all hang dog. It's so that whole set of shame circuitry might be deep in our genetic inheritance.
Yes, absolutely right. It's a great point you make, because there you go again. That's where we go again into the submissive defense. Okay.
Yes.
So the submissive defense is to lower your eye, not to show any defiance, and show that you are now recognizing your lower status. um, and dogs do exactly that. They recognize that they have done something that makes them vulnerable to your attack. It
Uh-huh.
makes them vulnerable to your anger or whatever. So in order for them to deal with them having become vulnerable to being attacked by you as a dominant dog, as it were, they then show this submissive behavior.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then you say, no, it's okay. And you pat them on the head and you say, no, it's
yeah,
okay. And then they like that.
yeah.
So you reintegrate them by patting them on the head and stroking them. This is what ends the shame, because you're then showing them it's
Yeah.
okay. This is not going to be a problem between us. I'm not going to push you away. I'm
Uh-huh.
not going to attack you. We're all right. And
Right.
then that relieves the anxiety, and the joy
Yeah.
will lick you again.
You refer to the big two kind of run through the book, which is caring slash altruism, the positive side of human nature, I guess, versus contest slash competition. That these are two sort of fundamental, I don't know whether to call them drives or what, but uh, forces in the way that we organize ourselves internally and externally. And so a lot of the book documents the negative side. You really thoroughly document the ways that we're competitive and destructive and evil. And and then you, towards the end of the book, you redeem us when you start going into compassion. But what do we know about the caring altruistic side of ourselves? Is that as built in, as universal, say, as our angelic selves as universal as our devils?
Yes, and some people would say even more so, actually. Some people would say that actually, because we existed in hunter-gatherer societies for so long, where caring and sharing was the key to survival, right? All of us in those groups, we are by nature. This is what makes us happiest. We're happiest. Our cardiovascular systems, our immune system, our brain, all of these things work much better when we're in groups of people where we feel cared about, we feel valued, um, where we also feel we can make a contribution that is of value to them. This is very clear. Whereas when we're in environments which are hostile, competitive, backstabbing, this is not so good for our health at all.
Yeah,
And so the caring psychologies, the caring motivational systems are hugely beneficial to the human brain and body, actually.
yeah,
So it's a motivational system that orientates how you pay attention, it orientates what you focus your thinking on, your behavior, and it orientates a whole range of physiological systems in your body. So we know that people who are very caring, for example, they have relatively good parasympathetic tone, that's part of the autonomic nervous system. Whereas people who are very competitive, they tend to be much more in the sympathetic drive, got to achieve, got to do, got to achieve, got to do system. So it's hugely different. These motivational systems have huge difference on a whole range of psychological and physiological processes going on within us.
you you paint a picture in which seemingly almost by accident, but it can't be by accident, I don't think, but that we've ended up with political structures that uh, that are based around the masculine drive, competition side of things, that side of the picture. And part of your argument is that it doesn't have to be that way, but it's historically that's how it's been, and so we assume that that's the full story of our nature.
Yes.
I mean, that's always been kind of a struggle. It's something I still struggle with, I think, in my own mind, that I question whether utopia is possible. If there's something in human nature that makes a utopian vision impossible. What are your thoughts on that? Because you've
No,
studied both sides quite a bit.
no, I think it's a brilliant point. It's an extremely important point because, as you would know, the Buddhists have really argued this all the way through, that a mind that doesn't know itself doesn't really understand what drives it. It doesn't understand its archetypes. It doesn't understand the sources of its desires and impulses. A mind like that simply acts out whatever comes into mind. There is no steering of the ship, as it were. There's no choices about, am I going to do this? Am I going to do that? And there's no guiding principle for deciding what you're going to do or what you're not going to do. So I think the key that the Buddhist position or the contemplative positions tells us is two things. Is firstly, let's understand our minds and what we're up against. And basically understanding that all of us are programmed. We're all programmed to behave in certain ways to pursue life tasks. And our programming gets influenced by the culture in which we grow. So, but we're all programmed. So like if I'd been kidnapped as a 3-year-old baby into a violent drug gang, I would be living a different set of programs than I am today, but we are programmed. So the first thing is what they call mindful awareness or mind awareness, of becoming aware that you have all this stuff in you. You didn't choose it. It's been built in there. You have a brain built for you, not by you. Nature's built this brain, right, to do different things, to survive and compete and have sex and rear children. This is all being built for us, right? So the key really is beginning to understand what's going on here, and then we can start to make choices. And the point about compassion is compassion then becomes the guiding light for you to choose how you're going to act in the world. So even if I feel aggressive, or even if I feel whatever it is, these things, rather than blaming and shaming myself or suppressing them, I acknowledge them, I accept them, but I don't act them out. So because I'm going to stick to a compassion orientation to life, I'm going to try to be helpful, not harmful. So I think part of the issue is the beginning of an awareness that we need to teach children about the nature of their mind. We've never done that. When I grew up, I don't know about you, David, but nobody taught me anything about how my mind works, or how to regulate my emotions, or why I would want to fancy Sally in the netball club. These things just arose in me. I didn't know anything about it. You're trying to work it out as you go, So training our children to understand their minds and training our children with compassion values, I think that is absolutely crucial for the generations to come. And that is beginning now to spread through the schools. We have a schools program, but mindfulness and compassion training, and that is a great hope, because when children understand these things, they're not going to be so taken over by the impulses and the things get stimulated within them. This is our great hope. So
yeah, one of the things that's been heartening during this pandemic is to see the good side come out and express itself so widely, not universally, but these people who are singing to each other, making music despite social distancing, and we have grandchildren who produce just wonderful art, and you can find videos online of things that children and that other people are creating, and it's so heartening. It's so heartwarming to see this in the face of this big threat.
That's a wonderful point, isn't it? Because what it shows us is that all of us are yearning for connectedness. We have a yearning for this, right? That's very, very important. And the second thing is that actually, compassion is not weak in any way. You think about all of the medics and the nurses and the doctors who are risking their lives to save us, right? They're putting their lives on the line. Firefighters or every day put their lives on the line to save us. Compassion is one of the most courageous one of the most courageous motives known to humans, right? Because we will engage in suffering. We will put ourselves in harm's way to save others. We will do what we can to address other people's suffering. So it's a phenomenally important motivation, but it gets suppressed because we get caught up in our competitive, needing a job, and we want to earn money, and you need to, all that stuff. So that competitive system can sometimes overlay this compassion. But what you're saying is so important, that when the conditions are right, we need to become compassionate. Not everybody, but most of us yearn for this connectedness, this caring and sharing of each other, this supporting of each other through the dark times. And even, as you say, in the case of our medical profession, risking their lives to do it. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. So on the one hand, you've got this amazing
Yeah.
outpouring of compassion. And yet, just less than 100 years ago, we had the Holocaust and goodness knows what. So it's coming to terms with the fact we are a species of extremes, and it's coming to terms with the fact that we have to work out how we are going to address the dark side of the mind. And part of what living like crazy is to say, look, compassion is not stupid. Compassion is not naive. This is the dark side. And if we're going to develop a compassionate society and build on these wonderful things that are happening, it's not about let's just be nice and kind. It's about how do we address the dark side, because it will try to emerge again. I mean, the right wing, the self-focus, the selfishness, the me first psychology, that will try to emerge again. So we have to find ways in which we have compassionate solutions for the dark side.
Yeah. The dark side. Listen to the force. The force.
Exactly. I mean, George Lucas said it all, really, didn't he?
Yeah. You have to tap into that side. So yeah, I think there is this fundamental. There fundamentally is some kind of a struggle between light and dark.
It is very much so. Yeah, very much
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
And it's not to try to, people will always compete, and that's important. I think sport is a very good analogy, really, because the idea of sport is competing, but with respect, respectful competition, competing with the rules of the game, and so forth and so forth.
Yeah.
What we have with Western capitalism is there's no respect. They're quite happy to destroy the environment. They're quite happy to go for tax havens and not pay their taxes. And vote for governments that want lower taxes, not higher taxes. They don't want to share in their products of their wealth. So that's not respectful competing. So we're going to compete, of course we are. You're not going to get rid of that. But we need to have much better refereeing. I mean, like with the banking crisis and so forth, lots and lots of economists have said our refereeing of competitive economics is bad, it's poor, it doesn't really exist. And that's part of the problem. So one of the things we have to do is to realize that if you don't referee, if you don't have strong rules in competition, people will cheat. And they do, even strong rules, they take drugs to get advantage or whatever it is. So you have to have strong rules, a strong police force is important for compassion. People think, how can that be? Because properly done, we don't want an aggressive police force, we want a respectful police force. They maintain the order, they make us all feel safe, because there's always going to be some individuals who will, unfortunately, try to exploit situations. That's just the way it is. So we can't be naive. There's no naivety in compassion. Compassion requires strong refereeing, respectfulness, and then we can compete.
Yeah. So who did you write this book for? When you said about writing it, what was the audience that you were picturing in your mind?
I think, it's a tricky question. It's very, very interesting. I mean, I remember an old economics lecture, because my first degree was in economics. It was in the Second World War and had some wonderful stories to tell. And he always said, I like to write books because I never know what I think until I've written one. And then when I've written it, I can decide if I agree with it or not.
I could totally understand that point of view. I've had that experience myself, is that I'm so divided on, seems like everything. I can always see the other side. That can be very paralyzing. But if I've got a deadline or something, or even writing about these interviews and so on, I have to decide, well, what is it that I think? And the writing it down kind of forces me to put a stake in the ground.
That's right. And I think with these books, right, you're trying to put together, it's like a massive jigsaw puzzle, and you have to just sort of, by writing, you have to organize the chapters. And because, I write about 10 pages for every page I publish, because I write it and I don't like it, write it and I don't like it. But it helps you organize quite a large array of information and ideas by writing them down, having to tell a story over 300 or 400 pages. So I partly write it to do that, but also I wanted to write a book which was very much about compassion is not a weakness. It's the strongest, most courageous motivation we have, because look, I'm a compassion therapist, but I can actually also address the dark side.
Yeah,
Compassion is not about being naive.
yeah, and I think that's a central message behind the book and justification for it, because that is a major critique of people who are on the light side, is that they're soft, naive, don't see things with don't really see reality clearly, that they're deluded, they're wearing pink sunglasses, whatever.
Yes, I mean, I think it's a brilliant point you made, because there is as you know, there's the white middle classes who've got nice lives and they take up compassion, and it's all about being happy and, let's be nice and all that stuff. And that's great. I'm not against that. That's wonderful. But the reality of compassion to change the world, if you're going to change the world, then you need the courage to look at the dark side, because if you don't, the dark side will get you. And so, as the Empress said, Luke, you have no idea the power of the dark side.
Yeah.
Well, actually, we do, because
uh,
we've had it for the last 5,000 years.
yeah, it's been
So,
playing all over the world, stomping
so,
around.
so this is, I think, for me, this is what part of what the book was about. Is, look, we have created environments where we spend so much money on weapons and working out ways of destroying and hurting each other and so on and so on, allowing the rich to just have, about 9 families own, half of the wealth of the world, or whatever the figure is. We can't go on like this. We just simply can't.
Yeah.
So but we're not quite sure what to do. I mean, everybody says, okay, look, this has been amazing. People singing to each other, a fantastic outpouring of a compassionate, desperate wish to come together for the benefit of others. Wonderful, wonderful. What we're not quite sure about is what's going to happen in a year's time, 2 years' time, right? When we
Yeah.
do have the vaccine and we do go back to feeling okay. And it's finding the solutions in the politics and the business in our own lives, for us to actually be aware that we will slip back into the shadows if we're not careful. So we just have to be aware, and we have to start building into our politics, into our businesses, into our schools, anti-dark side behaviors, basically.
So are you saying that this pandemic has a possible bright side in terms of presenting us with a pause, an opportunity to structure things differently?
Oh, very much so. I mean, you would never wish it, would you? But now that it's arrived, and now that we see what it's done, and now that we recognize just the wonderful, amazing courage of our medical staff, our, fire services, the help, all the volunteers. I mean, millions and millions and millions of people in your country, my country, just desperately trying to be helpful to other people. Once we see that we do have this potential, the next thing is, how do we actually make that part of how we organize our societies and our cultures? And we need to address the neoliberal agendas in the right wing, because they will pull us to the dark side, I'm afraid. So we just need to be honest about these things. And this is not against capitalism. It's more and more about actually understanding that if you don't regulate capitalism, you're going to have trouble. So it's just being sensible in a way. And one of the things I'm very interested in is we've seen so much courage from our medical staff and so on and so on. We need the same courage in our politicians to address injustice. We need the same courage in our politicians to address Western interests. We need the same courage in our politicians to say we all have to build our medical services throughout the world. Because one of the things all humans should have is access to the best healthcare they can get. You shouldn't be able to buy it. Okay, so we need courageous politicians all over the world to actually fight for compassionate values. That's the issue, whether they will or whether they won't. Uh, and that at the moment we're not sure about.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have any reflections for people who about getting through this pandemic? You know, there are people out there that are very fearful, feeling isolated, and so on.
Well, yes, I think the first thing is that although it's very, very difficult to tell because the figures that are being thrown at you all the time are very, very tough. The evidence is, look, this for most people who are not over a certain age, over 70 or whatever the age is, and don't have underlying health conditions, for most people, if you did get the virus, you would recover. And there are people, the other thing to focus on, there are people who are working, who will work to save you, who will risk their lives to save you. So this is a very important focus for us to recognize we are also living in a world where there are all these amazing people who will do everything they can to save me. Rather than focusing on my fear, I focus on the compassion of others there to be helpful to me.
Uh-huh.
The next thing that you say, so this is focusing on, isn't this amazing? We've got these people out there they will try and help me as best they can. That changes the psychology. See, if I just focus on I'm frightened myself, me,
Uh-huh.
that really locks you in your fear system. But if you think, yes, I am frightened about that, but just let me keep in my mind all these amazing, wonderful people who will be there to try to help me as best they can, that will change your orientation, you know. The second thing you ask is about how do we deal with loneliness? And this is such an important point. I think the key thing, as you say, is try to use whatever technologies you can. Try to find out if there are any groups around you who are involved in helping others, because one of the things that's important is the feeling that we're making a contribution. You know, some people say it's not just that I'm lazy, it's not just I'm lonely, but I feel just sitting here in myself in my flat or whatever, I'm not doing anything. Who needs me? I'm not making a contribution. So try to find out from the internet or whatever if there's any groups around you who are delivering food packages or whatever it is, charities that you could get involved with. Get involved with a charity that's out there helping people, because that will help you feel better. You'll feel part of something, right? So it's
Yeah.
not just talking to friends and relationships. That's very important, but try to get involved with a voluntary organization or something like that. And then the other thing, of course, is using the time to develop whatever you want to do. So use the time to do a course online or learn a foreign language or whatever. So
Yeah.
there are lots of different processes, I think, but connectedness, wherever you have an opportunity to form a connectedness to other people, do try and do that as best you can.
That's a great message and a good place for us to move on into our lives. uh, so, Dr. Paul Gilbert, I really want to thank you for being my guest again on Shrink Wrap Radio.
It's been a great pleasure, David, and thank you for your wonderful questions and opportunities to talk about these things.